Today I want to tell you about my grandmother's kitchen. My grandmother's kitchen was not only the center of their home, but the center of the family. It's remarkable how much living you can put into a single room, especially one that has 4 doors, one on each side. So, first I'll describe my grandmother's kitchen. As you walk into the kitchen from the living room, dining room, and turn left, there's a door that goes down into the root cellar. Now, when you open the door and you start down the stairs, on the right-hand side there's a ledge, and the whole ledge is covered with bottles of vinegar. And in front of you is a ladder that kind of looks like shelves, but it's a ladder that goes up into the attic, and it has cans of lye that was used for making soap. And on the right-hand side, there were hooks for hanging slickers, and the ledge contained galoshes and outdoor type stuff that could be grabbed in a hurry if you had to run out the door real quick. And as you go down the stairs end about halfway into the room. The cellar was dirt. It had never been finished with concrete or anything like that. It was dirt, but it had shelves all the way around. So at the bottom of the stairs, on the right-hand side, was shelves, and the shelves contained homemade wine and homemade brandy and cordials and medicinal type things. For example, elderberry syrup, which could be used on pancakes, but it was also a great cough expectorant. Horehound syrup and horehound cough drops. The horehound was used in for coughs as to soothe coughs, to keep you from coughing, unlike the elderberry, which was an expectorant. And there was rhubarb sauce, and there were salves made from purified chicken fat and beeswax that had things like yarrow in it for bleeding, and some that just all kinds of herbs and medicines and homemade medicines and things like that my grandmother made. Those whole shelves. Primarily, though, it was for homemade wine. Homemade cherry wine, homemade peach wine, homemade elderberry wine, homemade dandelion wine. It wasn't unusual when I was a child. We sat down to dinner. Everybody had a glass of wine. When we were very little, and started wanting to drink wine like the adults, our wine was cut half water and half wine. But probably by the time I was 7 or 8, a glass of wine with dinner was not something that was uncommon. And it all came from my grandmother's root cellar. So that was on the left-hand side at the bottom of the stairs. Directly in front was a long shelf. That wall was about 10 foot long. And the first half of it was jams and jellies. Apple jelly, apple sauce. No, apple jelly, apple butter, pear honey, strawberry jam, raspberry jam, cherry jelly, peach jam, all any kind of jam that you can imagine, and jelly was on the first half of the shelf. And on the second half was canned fruits. A few canned apples, because most of the time the apples, when we picked them, went on racks that went under the beds. So the bedrooms in the fall and winter always smelled like apples. But canned pears, canned peaches, canned apricots, rhubarb sauce, whatever fruit, plums, canned cherries, everything, fruit, was on that shelf, and it went all the way to the corner. When you turn the corner, then it was vegetables. And that wall was about 8 foot long, so it was vegetables. It was corn and green beans and English peas and beets and any kind of vegetable that could be canned was there. And then you turn the next corner and come back from the corner back to where the stairs were, and that was all pickles. It was gallons of dill pickles and sweet pickles and watermelon pickles and pickled pig's feet and pickled eggs and every kind of pickle that you can imagine. Oh, and pickled relish and chow chow and anything pickled was on that shelf. And in the center was a little table with a crock on it that I'll talk about a little bit later. So then you go back up the stairs and you turn to the left again, and there's the door to the bathroom, the only one in the house, and my grandparents' bedroom, and the bedroom that my brothers and I used when we stayed with my grandparents. And next to that door was the refrigerator, and then after that was the door that went out back, and out back went to the wash house and the smokehouse and the barrels where we stored carrots and cabbages and stuff like that in the ground in the wintertime. Next to the back door was the kitchen sink. On one side, it had bank of drawers, and there were tablecloths and dishcloths and dish towels, and there was a drawer that had string and scissors and everything that you could ever imagine needing in a kitchen. And above that was a breadboard where you could knead bread or roll out pie dough or that kind of stuff. Then the sink, and then there was a pull-out bin that was used for putting trash and stuff like that in. And next to that was a Hoosier. And for those people who don't know what a Hoosier is, a Hoosier, well, I don't mean the football teams and stuff like that, but a Hoosier was a kitchen cabinet that was designed for westward travel. It was small enough to fit into a covered wagon to be used as you travel as a kitchen. But once you got to where you were going, you could take it out and put it in a cabin or a tent or whatever you were going to live in. And the cook of the family, whether it's the lady of the house or one of the gentlemen who are traveling west, whoever's doing the kitchen, has a kitchen that's already set up. The Hoosier that I have in my house now, on the left-hand side, it has a pull-out bin that you could put flour and stuff like that in, close it up, and then open the door down below, and you keep a bowl underneath the bottom of it because you take the cap off, and there's a little crank you can turn, and it sifts your flour for you into a measuring cup or into a bowl or whatever. And there's a little shelf in front where you can keep baking soda and baking powder and measuring cups and measuring spoons and that kind of thing. Next to that is your dish cabinet where you can store plates and glasses and mugs and that kind of stuff. And underneath that there's a little roll top thing that comes down and covers it. But that's your canisters, where you put your canisters for salt and pepper and tea and coffee and sugar and all that kind of stuff. And then there's a shelf in front that's a workspace, and that workspace pulls out. So when it's pushed in, you have about a 2 by 4 foot workspace. When you pull it out, you've got about a 3 or 3.5 foot by 4 foot workspace. And underneath you have a cabinet door that opens where you can put pots and pans and that kind of thing. And then on the right hand side all the way, you have 2 little drawers for silverware and cooking utensils. And then on the very bottom, you have a bread bin. Now, a bread bin is different. It's not made out of wood. Well, the front of it's made out of wood, but the drawer itself is made out of metal with little holes poked into it. You put your bread in there to keep your bread fresh, but keep it away from the mice or the rats or anything that might get into it. And this drawer is remarkably good at keeping bread fresh and keeping it from molding and going stale. I don't know why the metal drawer works that way, but it certainly does. So next to the sink was the Hoosier, and that went all the way to the corner. Then on the next wall was a big stove. It had a little oven, and it had a big oven, and 4 burners on the top on the outside. And in the center there was lid that would lift up, and it had a burner underneath that with a griddle on it. And then there's the door, another door after the stove, which went out onto the wraparound porch and to the left into the still room. Now, the still room had a big chest freezer with shelves up above it. On the next wall, at the end of the freezer, the wall turned, and on that wall was the table for taking care of the milk. It had room to set your buckets and your jars, and a shelf underneath where jars could have been sterilized and then turned upside down so that they would stay sterile. And the milk separator was on that. Now, first you milk the cow, then you strain the milk through a strainer that takes all any extraneous dirt or anything like that might have been on the cow's udder out of the milk. Then you pour the milk into the milk separator, which is a kind of a centrifuge. You crank it, and as you crank it, the centrifuge turns, and it separates the cream from the milk. And then there was a space for fermenting milk. My grandparents did not use as much milk at their house as we did, so they always had extra. So there was always this big crock sitting there that my grandmother would pour extra milk into, and she would let it set until it curdled, and you had the whey would go to the bottom, and then what my grandmother called clabber, which is curds from you remember Little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet and ate her curds and whey. Well, the curds were pretty much what we call yogurt now, before it separated from the whey. And so my grandmother would very carefully pour the whey off and then strain well, sometimes she would heat the curd and make cottage cheese, and sometimes she would save the curd as yogurt, but she would strain it through cheesecloth to get all the whey out. Then she would take the whey and put it on the stove and put a very low heat fire, and when it got to the right temperature, she had this wooden paddle about an inch wide and a quarter of an inch thick or something like that. And she would start, when the whey got to the right temperature, she would start making circles in the whey with this paddle. And pretty soon it started collecting these long strings of white stuff. And she would stir and stir and stir and stir, keeping the temperature of the whey at exactly the same temperature. And pretty soon, no more white strings were going on it. And there would be this big ball, this big white mass on this paddle. And she would take it off and stretch it out and twist it, pull it back on itself and pull it out and twitch it and put it back again. And lo and behold, there is a great big twisted ball of mozzarella cheese. And then the rest of the whey whatever was left in the pot would be given to the chickens or the pigs or whatever animal got to the slop pot first. Then the curds were made into either cottage cheese or yogurt. Usually she sweetened the curds with just a little bit of honey. didn't put fruit in our yogurt. We had just a little bit of honey. And then the cream, some of it went into the refrigerator to cook with or to make whipped cream from or something like that. But most of that went into the cream crock, which sat there until there was enough cream in it, probably about 4 or 5 days. And then it went into the churn to become butter. And then you had the butter, and then you had the buttermilk. And the buttermilk went in the refrigerator. Sometimes it went into buttermilk pies. Anyway, that was the milk station. And then to the right of that on the next wall were two big bins. And they were big wooden bins made out of home-grown, home-milled cedar. And in one of the bins was two 25-pound bags of sugar and two 25-pound bags of flour. And then in the other bin, there were potatoes. And then there was a rack on the next wall, and it had dried herbs. It had dried thyme, dried sage, dried rosemary, dried lavender, dried oregano, dried yarrow, dried garlic, cloves, and all of the homegrown spice herbs that we grew or gathered here. It had dried spearmint that we gathered out of the creek, and dried watercress, shepherd's purse, which makes a really spicy little pepper flavored spice when it's ground up. All that kind of stuff was on hanging on racks on that wall. So then you go back into the kitchen from the still room. Next to the still room door was a window. That's the window that Pet looked in when he wanted to come in or when he wanted a biscuit. And then you turn the corner. Oh, I have to tell you about that corner. In that corner, when we were little, up until the time that Marshall was out of a high chair, that's where the high chair sat. But when Marshall was big enough, he no longer needed a high chair. That's where the kitchen stool went. And you always knew that you were safe and out of the way and wouldn't get yelled at if you went to the cookie jar and got a couple of cookies and went and sat on the kitchen stool in that corner. Right next to the kitchen stool was a built-in dish cupboard. Now, this was something that was popular in homes in the 20s and 30s. Maybe before that, I don't know. But it was a very interesting cupboard. And interestingly enough, I lived in 3 different houses that had this kind of a cupboard. The center portion of it, from about 2.5 foot high to about 7 foot high, was a dish cupboard. You opened it up. It had 2 doors, and you would open it up, and on one side you had everyday dishes, and on the other side you had your fancy dinner dishes. But the interesting thing is you could walk around the wall to the dining room side of the wall, and you could open it up. So you could take the dishes out of the cupboard, put them on the table, set the table without ever entering the kitchen, because you could take the dishes out on the dining room side. And then the dishes came back to the sink, got washed, and then you put them into the cupboard from the kitchen side. It was a very convenient arrangement. Don't know why they don't still do it in houses, because, boy, it made things so much easier. And then underneath there was cupboard, and it had things like oatmeal, Quaker's oat, the box thing that came in, and Cheerios and shredded wheats and extra cans of coffee and extra cans of tea, canisters of tea, that kind of thing that you would need. Oh, it had, that's where the raisins were kept, and the chocolate chips, and the prunes, and special juices like prune juice or apple juice or something like that. All that was kept underneath there. And then up above the dishes, there was another little area that opened only into the kitchen, and it had fascinating stuff in it. It was way too high for a kid to ever reach. And so I know that there were times it had things in it that kids weren't supposed to see. But I do remember it had the popcorn popper that you put the popcorn in and you put it over the fire in the fireplace and you would shake it and make popcorn. And it had a hot water bottle and it had the bedpan that my grandmother used. It was a brass pan with a long wooden handle and a lid. And my grandmother would put coals in it out of the fireplace and close the lid. And then she would take that to our bed in the wintertime and she would run it between the sheets really slowly and she would warm the bed. And as soon as she got finished, we would jump in the bed and snuggle down in the warm spot and stay there all night because if you stuck your toes out of where she had warmed it with the bedpan, the sheets were cold. So the only heat that they had in the house was the fireplace. So and the stove in the kitchen. And so the bedrooms in the wintertime got very cold and it was very nice to have that um, little warm spot in your bed when you crawled into bed at night. So that was my grandmother's kitchen. And the most wonderful one other thing. In the middle of the kitchen was a big deal table. It was at least 3 foot wide, maybe closer to 4 foot wide, and somewhere between 6 and 8 foot long. I can't tell you exactly now. I don't remember exactly how long it was. But the deal table was where all the action was. That's where the bread was kneaded and the biscuits were cut and the sides of beef were cut up and wrapped up and put in the freezer and where the pies were put together and where the cookies were cooled and where the cakes were decorated and where the vegetables were chopped and all of that stuff was done on the table. Sometimes my grandmother did it all by herself, and sometimes it was done as a family. All the canning was done on that table. All of the pears peeled, and all of the peaches peeled, and everything put in jars. All of the canning that my grandparents did was done at that table. Now, we always ate breakfast at that table. And many times, if we weren't out working cattle or outside where we were having a packed lunch, we ate lunch at the table as well. But never dinner. Dinner was always eaten at the dining room table. Oh, wonderful things came out of that kitchen. When the monsoon rain started, my grandmother would send us all down with Granddad to the point of the hill in the east pasture, and we would gather mushrooms. And my grandmother, when we first got back, she would stir up a mess of mushrooms, and we would sit down and eat mushrooms and onions. And then there would be mushrooms and onions over steak for dinner, and then she would bread the mushrooms and she would fry the mushrooms and for 2 or 3 days we would eat mushrooms. And every day, as long as the mushrooms were coming up and growing, we would go down and gather more mushrooms. And my grandmother would, when we got tired of eating mushrooms, it took us like 3 or 4 days of eating nothing else before we got tired of mushrooms. My grandmother would then cut the mushrooms up and fry them sometimes by themselves, sometimes with onions, and then she would can those and put them in the cellar for when we wanted mushrooms, but the mushrooms weren't growing. In those days, it was pretty hard to get fresh mushrooms in the grocery store. You could get canned mushrooms, but it was hard to get the fresh mushrooms. And my grandmother's mushrooms that she sauteed in butter were so much better than the canned mushrooms you could buy. And then um, my grandmother made wonderful enchiladas and spaghetti and steaks and potatoes and roasts that would just melt in your mouth. and chili. My grandmother received as a wedding present a recipe for chili that takes about 12 hours to make. I've made that recipe once or twice for very special occasions, but my grandmother used to make a big mess of this chili in the wintertime, and it was so good. But it didn't have like hamburger or something like that. No, you had to cook a roast and pull the roast and then chop up the pulled meat. And that was the base for the chili. And all of the vegetables and the peppers and the spices and everything were hand ground. Oh my gosh. That was the best chili I've ever eaten in my life. To some of you people who use the recipes from like the Five Alarm chili and all that kind of stuff where you're supposed to put tomato sauce in it, yeah, this chili didn't have any tomatoes in it at all. Believe me. It was so good. So, and on top of that, fresh buttermilk. If you've ever had a buttermilk pie, you'll fall in love with it. But if you've ever had a buttermilk pie made with fresh buttermilk right out of the churn and free range eggs and freshly churned butter, you'll think it melts in your mouth. It just absolutely melts in your mouth. And then my grandmother had a recipe that her mother gave her. I still have the letter that my great grandmother sent to my grandmother. And she said, you have to have this recipe. This pie is called He'll Fall in Love with You All Over Again pie. And believe me, it is a very good pie. But we also had apple pies from Granddad's Shenango trees. And we had gooseberry pies and cherry pies and rhubarb strawberry pies and pear pies and peach cobblers and apricot cobblers, and that's just the pastries. And then we had cakes, and once in a while, because we had our own eggs and we had our own cream, my granddad would talk my grandmother into making ice cream. And we had this old wooden ice cream bucket. And it had a cylinder that you filled with the cream, and it had the beaters that went down into it. And it went into this bucket, and this thing came over the top that was attached to a crank handle. And you would put ice in it, and then you would put salt in it, and you would crank, and you would crank, and you would crank, and you would crank, and you would crank. And your arm would give out, and somebody else would take over cranking, and cranking, and cranking, and cranking. And pretty soon it would start getting hard to crank. And then Granddad would take over, and he would crank, and crank, and crank. And pretty soon the yell would go out, "Ice cream's ready!" And everybody would come running, and we would sit down right there, take the paddle out, shake it off, take a long-handled spoon and put it in the bowls, and sit and eat the ice cream until it was all gone. That was so wonderful on a hot summer day, and especially when you got to sit in the shade of the wraparound porch and rock in one of the rocking chairs and eat the ice cream and listen to Granddad's stories. Ah, what a joy. I had such a wonderful childhood. I really just can't believe how wonderful some of my memories are. And sitting here, I can almost taste that peach ice cream made with fresh cream, egg, sugar, fresh peaches, or strawberry ice cream made with fresh and raspberry ice cream made with fresh, warm raspberries right off the vine and just rinsed and tossed to dry and then put in the cream and made into ice cream. Yeah, I had a very special childhood, let me tell you. Okay, so other things that came out of that kitchen. Well, maybe now it's time to tell you about my grandmother's Christmas cakes. One of the things that my grandmother did every year that nobody else could match because they didn't understand how she did it was to take all of the neighbors' Christmas cakes. The one thing she required is that when they finished the Christmas cake, they had to bring the cake tin back to her. Because I think she would make something like 30 Christmas cakes. If you have 30 cake tins, when I say a cake tin, I don't mean the pan you make it in. If you have ever gotten a fruit cake that comes in one of the metal tins, that's what I'm referring to as a cake tin. And my grandmother would make 30 of these cakes. It was, let me see here. We started in late May, early June. So let's just say June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So that's 7 months to make these Christmas cakes. And so I'll explain why in just a minute why it took so long. But because the process was so long, there was nobody else in the county who would do this. And so to be on Honey's Christmas cake list was an honor. And the process oftentimes included the entire family. So, do you remember I told you down in the root cellar there was a little table with a 3-gallon crock sitting on it? Well, that's where almost where the whole process starts. Granddad every year, Honey and Granddad made wine, and they almost always made apricot or peach brandy. And to make brandy, first you make the wine, the apricot or the peach wine, and then Granddad would set up the still, and he would distill the wine into brandy. And because the wine, you added a little bit of sugar to the wine before you distilled it to raise the alcohol content, and then you distill it and bottle. So every year they would take about 3 or 4 bottles. No, it was more than that, because they ended up with almost a gallon of brandy. So I'd say maybe 6 or 7 bottles of wine, and they would distill the apricot or the peach wine into brandy, and then put that on the shelf to be used later on. Along comes May, and we're doing the strawberries, picking the strawberries. And in the bottom of the crock, my grandmother would add about a 2-inch layer of strawberries washed, cleaned, and cut up, and a cup of sugar, and enough of the apricot brandy or peach brandy to cover the strawberries. And she would go down and check it every week or so until the next fruit came in. Make sure it didn't need a little bit more sugar or a little bit more brandy, but it was always covered with a cloth, a dish towel or something. And then the next thing to come in would be maybe raspberries. So she'd put a layer of raspberries, more sugar, more brandy. And the next thing to come in, let's see, strawberries, raspberries. The next thing to come in would be the cherries. And so there'd be 2 inches of cherries. And these weren't the big, sweet cherries you get in the store now. These were little bitty tiny pie cherries that every one of them had to be pitted. And oh, they were sour, but boy, did they have a wonderful flavor when you added sugar. And then very finely chopped rhubarb. And then what would it be next? Peaches, and then plums, and then apricots, and then pears, and then apples. Did I miss? Oh, I missed the grapes. Yeah. Anyway, as they became ripe, they would go into this crock. And every time they'd go into the crock, a cup of sugar is added and enough brandy to cover. And more fruit, sugar, brandy. Fruit. Let me tell you, when you started carrying jellies and jams and canned fruit and stuff down into the root cellar to put it on the shelves, after a month or so of this stuff sitting and fermenting on that table, you could become downright intoxicated on only the fumes down there. But anyway, just before Thanksgiving, my grandmother would get everything ready on the deal table and have my dad go down and carry up that crock. a 3-gallon crock is heavy anyway, but when it's full of fruit and brandy, it's even fuller. But he would carry that up. My grandmother would take a long handled wooden spoon and stir it. Now, when I mean long handled, I mean the handle on that spoon was like 2 foot long. And she would very gently stir all the fruit. And then she would take it was a big enamel pot she used for canning and a double layer of cheesecloth. And my grandmother would hold one side of the cheesecloth and my grandfather the other. And Daddy would turn the brandied fruit upside down over the cheesecloth so that all the liquid drained out. And they would hold it there until most of the liquid had drained out, and then they dumped all of the fruit into this very clean washed round dishpan that it was big dishpan. My grandmother would add some sugar and then crack eggs. I probably 2 dozen eggs she cracked and put in there, and she didn't stir it with a spoon or anything. She worked it with her hands till she worked all of the eggs through, all of the sugar into it. Then she would put in a pound, or maybe it was even 2 pounds of melted butter, and she would work that in. And finally, she would mix together, it was about 10 pounds of flour with, I don't know, a half a cup, maybe it was a whole cup of baking soda. I'm not sure. She would stir that all in, and then she would stir in cinnamon and cloves and I don't know, maybe I think some ginger as well into that, and mix the spices all up in the flour. And then she would start a couple of scoops at a time, probably a 2-cup scoop. Put a couple of those of the flour baking soda mixture into the fruit, and she would work that in with her hands. Put a couple more scoops in, work that into it, and she worked in all the flour, and the batter was thicker than pancake batter or waffle batter, thicker than the cake batter that you would use today, but not as thick as, say, biscuits. But it was thick enough that you had to use a spoon. And she had these ring form pans, kind of like what we would call bunt pans today, except that they didn't have the ridges in them, they were smooth. And she had 6 or 8 of those, and she would spoon the stuff in, put the cake in. I think they each had to cook for about an hour. Take them out, turn them upside down on racks, and empty the cake out. Wash the pan, butter and flour the pans, fill it up with dough, put it back in until she had cooked all 30 of the cakes. And sometimes I think she and Granddad would stay up till 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, at least she would. I imagine Granddad went and got a couple hours sleep, because I know he was always up at 5 o'clock feeding the horses. But she would stay up all night cooking these cakes and putting them on racks to cool on the deal table. Then go get some sleep and get up and then start lining the cake tins with plastic wrap. And then she took long skewers and poked holes in the tops of all of the cakes after they'd cooled, and then put them in the cake tins. Now, she made 2 different kinds of this cake. One was for the teetotalers, and one was for those people who didn't mind Christmas cakes being called rum cakes. And so she would count out the teetotalers she had. She would take any leftover apricot brandy, pour that into a half-gallon jar, and then restrain the juice that was left over from the fruit that they poured off the fruit, and fill the jar the rest of the way up with that fruit juice that still had brandy in it, because the cellar stays 52, 54 degrees year round, and it takes 70 degrees centigrade in order to evaporate alcohol. So not much of it evaporated. Enough you could smell it down there, but not all of it. So it still had alcohol in it. So she would fill the jar up with that, and then she would take the rest of the juice and bottle it, and we used that to make our Christmas punch. So then she would take, for the teetotalers, about a half a cup of this brandied fruit mixture, and she would pour that over the top of each of the, about a half a cup, I think, over the top of each cake, and then wrap the plastic around the top of the cake, put the top of the tin on, and put a label on top of it, who it was for. And she always said, "Oh, no, no, no. I don't use rum on yours. I just use fruit juice." Well, she wasn't lying. It was fermented fruit juice, but anyway. And then she took rum and put a half a cup of rum on top of the ones that the people who wanted rum cake, and did the same thing, folded the plastic in, put the name on top of it. I think she reserved probably about 4 of those for our family to have. And then they were put away somewhere. Now, this happened right before Thanksgiving. So they were put up on a shelf somewhere. I really don't remember where. I don't think there was room in the cellar for them. There wasn't room underneath the beds because they were full of apples. So maybe it went out in the still room or something like that. I'm not sure where these all these cake tins went. But they sat in with the rum or the brandy saturating the cakes until about the 20th of December. And the 20th of December, honey and granddad and sometimes my brothers, I almost always went. We went around and we delivered all these cakes. Aunt Bess and Uncle George Dingwall always got one. Lindy and Eileen Lindemood always got one. The Creels got one. Mrs. Arnold always got one. Dr. Jimmy got one. Dr. Horton got one. Just all over town. It was like all day that we were going around and delivering these cakes, and people's eyes would just light up when they saw us coming. But just to give you an example of how potent these cakes were, one year, I was probably 10, maybe 11 years old. A new young dentist moved into Ruidoso. He was the young junior partner at our family dentist's office, Dr. Jimmy. Dr. Jimmy was our dentist, and the young man, his name was Howard Tate. He had just graduated, got his medical degree, got his medical license, and gotten married, and moved to Ruidoso to become Dr. Beale's junior partner. So Dr. Beale and Dr. Horton brought Dr. Tate, and their wives all came out, and we were going to have a big fried rabbit dinner. My grandmother took this big long dining room table that she had, put all of the leaves in it. We had all the kitchen chairs and all the dining room chairs and stools and even bedroom chairs, I think, around this table with all of us there. And Dr. Jimmy was sitting on one side of Dr. Tate. Dr. Horton was sitting on the other side of Dr. Tate. And every time somebody would call his attention to one end of the table, my grandmother might have called Dr. Tate's attention away. Dr. Jimmy would refill Dr. Tate's wine glass with elderberry wine. So his glass was never empty. He never asked for a second glass. And when dessert time came, every time his attention was called to the other end of the table, Dr. Horton would put a little bit more of the Christmas cake on his plate. I guess it was a form of initiation or hazing. I'm not really sure what. But that young man had to be poured into Dr. Jimmy's car when he got ready to leave. And he told me one time when I was talking to him after he opened his own practice and he became my dentist, I was reminding Dr. Tate of that particular time. And he told me that he had a hangover for 2 solid days. He said, I learned very quickly to not trust anybody when it came to uh, alcohol. He said it broke me of ever getting drunk again. He said that was the worst hangover anybody could ever imagine. And it's absolutely true. The Christmas cake should have had a warning label on it that said, "Do not eat and drive," because it really could knock you for a loop. You wanted little small pieces and distance in between them. So that's kind of the story of my grandmother's kitchen, the center of the home, the center of the family. I don't know that anyone has the experience nowadays of having that kind of center to your life, where it's not just your nuclear family of mom and dad and the kids, but mom and dad and the kids and all the friends who come to visit and all the neighbors who come in who join, in and around that kitchen, who sit there and chop vegetables or peel pears or whatever the family is doing, whatever they're cooking or doing in the kitchen at that time. I do know that any time in the middle of the day when we walked in and found my granddad sitting at the head of the kitchen table drinking a glass of iced tea, it was always an excuse for, "Granddad, Granddad, tell us a story." I can also say that that's the place that I learned to cook. I remember standing on an apple box with a rolling pin, trying to roll out pastry. I was so little, I couldn't have been more than 4 years old. I'm standing on this apple box with this big rolling pin rolling out pie crust. And I know that that pie crust somehow turned into a pie that I made. I imagine, while I wasn't looking, my grandmother rolled out pie crust elsewhere, and she sent me to wash my hands, and all of a sudden the pie crust that was pretty lumpy and pretty messy that I'd been rolling on became the one that my grandmother had rolled out elsewhere. And then she comes over with a pie plate and she says, "Let me show you how to put this pie crust." She said, "You put the plate here and you slide this underneath your pie crust. You hold them together and you turn the pie plate over and see how that pie crust just folds nicely. And then we pat it down this way. And now you have to make another pie crust for the top." Oh, and I remember when she showed me how to make the lattice pie crust too. Maybe the next stories I should tell you are of the box dinners and the pie suppers. That would be fun. But for right now, I'm thirsty. I need something to drink. My mouth is dry. I love you all. Hope you hear me again soon.